What if everything you believe is a lie? That's right, your mind, the holy temple of your ego, is stuffed with myths, bad habits, and plain old BS. And here's the kicker, you cling to it, tooth and nail, like it's sacred. Well, guess what? It's not. Welcome to the world of Changing Minds by Howard Gardner, where we break down your mental walls brick by brick. Introduction. Howard Gardner, the brilliant mind behind this book, isn't just some dude with opinions. He's a cognitive psychologist who's made it his life's work to dissect the mysterious beast known as the human mind. And in this masterpiece, Gardner teaches us how minds change, or resist change like a cat avoiding a bath. Gardner explores why shifting perspectives is as painful as pulling teeth, even though our survival often depends on it. Whether you're a leader, teacher, or just someone desperate to change Aunt Karen's conspiracy theories at Thanksgiving dinner, this book is your golden ticket. Let's dive in. Welcome to Mindful Reads Hub. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Contents of the Mind. Let's cut to the chase. Your mind? It's a glorified junk drawer. Howard Gardner starts this book by ripping apart the cozy lies we tell ourselves about how we think. You imagine your brain as this sharp, rational machine that makes logical choices and acts in your best interest. Spoiler, it doesn't. What Gardner tells us is simple. Your mind is a cluttered mess of concepts, stories, theories, and skills, all mashed together into one chaotic stew. And unless you're actively decluttering and organizing, it's no surprise you're running around in mental circles. Gardner isn't here to coddle you. He doesn't want you to feel good about your bad habits. He wants you to face the brutal truth that your mind's contents are not only outdated but also set in stone unless you make a Herculean effort to change them. We're not talking about switching from Pepsi to Coke. No, this is the kind of mental reprogramming that feels like pulling teeth without anesthesia. Why? Because your brain, despite its miraculous capabilities, is lazy. When Gardner talks about the contents of the mind, he's referring to four main things: concepts, stories, theories, and skills. These aren't just fancy psychological terms. They're the building blocks of how you perceive and navigate the world. Take concepts, for example. They're the labels you slap on things to make sense of them. Dog, democracy, donut, all concepts. But here's the problem. Your concepts are often wrong or overly simplistic. Your idea of success might still be stuck in the third grade "I want to be an astronaut" phase. Your concept of love might be a sappy Hollywood cliche. See the issue? Then there are stories, and boy, are we addicted to them. Stories are how we make sense of the chaos around us. Your brain spins tales about why you didn't get that promotion, my boss is a jerk, why your relationship failed, they couldn't handle my awesomeness, and why you're not rich yet. The system is rigged. But Gardner points out a harsh reality. These stories are rarely accurate. They're comforting lies your mind cooks up to protect your fragile ego. Theories are another beast entirely. While stories are personal and emotional, theories are supposed to be rational and universal. Key word, supposed. Gardner warns us that many of our personal theories are junk. Ever meet someone who has a theory about why aliens built the pyramids? That's what we're dealing with here. You have theories about relationships, success, politics, and even yourself, and most of them are half-baked at best. Lastly, there are skills. The actual things you can do. Playing the piano, making a perfect omelette, or even parallel parking without breaking a sweat. Skills are the most practical part of the mind's contents, but they're also the easiest to overlook. Gardner reminds us that skills don't exist in isolation. They're influenced by your concepts, stories, and theories. If you believe you're a terrible cook, you're probably not going to develop the skill of making soufflés anytime soon. One of the most interesting parts of this chapter is Gardner's anecdote about Nicholson Baker, an author who realized he'd changed his mind without even noticing. Baker used to fantasize about furnishing his apartment with forklifts and backhoes as seating. Don't ask why, it's not the point. What matters is that, over time, this bizarre idea faded from his mind without any conscious decision. Gardner uses this story to illustrate how our minds change gradually and often without us realizing it. Think about it. How many of your current beliefs are the result of intentional thought versus passive drift? Exactly. Gardner doesn't just stop at describing the mess in your head. He also explains why changing minds is so damn hard. It's because our mental contents aren't just thoughts, they're deeply tied to our identity. When you challenge someone's concept of success or their favorite political theory, you're not just arguing about ideas, you're attacking their sense of self. That's why debates on Facebook never end well. The key takeaway from this chapter: changing minds, including your own, isn't about tossing out a bad idea and replacing it with a shiny new one. It's about rewiring the way you think from the ground up. And let's be honest, most people don't have the guts or the patience for that. But if you're tired of living in the mental equivalent of a hoarder's house, Gardner's here to show you the way. Just be ready to get uncomfortable, because clearing out the junk in your mind means confronting some ugly truths about yourself. So, here's the challenge. Take a hard look at your concepts, stories, theories, and skills. Which ones are serving you and which ones are holding you back? If you're brave enough to do that, you're already ahead of 90% of people. The rest? They'll keep living in their mental clutter, blissfully unaware that they're drowning in their own BS. Don't be one of them. Chapter 2. The Forms of the Mind. Here's a brutal truth for you. It's not just the contents of your mind that are a mess. It's the forms they take. You might think your thoughts are these perfectly packaged ideas, ready to spring into action. They're not. Your mind, as Gardner explains in this chapter, is more like a clunky filing cabinet, stuffed with poorly labeled folders, some written in languages you don't even speak. If the contents are the what of your mind, the forms are the how. And spoiler alert, you've probably been doing it wrong this whole time. Gardner wastes no time laying it out. The way we represent ideas, whether in words, pictures, numbers, or music, shapes how we think about them. And yet, most of us never stop to question whether we're using the right form. Think about it. You try to explain your feelings about a bad breakup in words, when maybe what you need is a meme or a playlist of sad Taylor Swift songs. Your form is wrong, and your brain is choking on its own inefficiency. Here's where Gardner gets spicy. He's not just talking about individual failures, he's calling out the entire history of psychology. For decades, researchers obsessed over behaviors and completely ignored the forms of the mind. Behaviorism, that old school psychology approach, decided it didn't even matter what was going on inside your head. As long as they could count how many times you pushed a lever for a pellet, they were satisfied. But Gardner is having none of that nonsense. He drags behaviorism out into the light, kicks it in the teeth, and then shows us the shiny new cognitive science that replaced it. This is where things get fascinating and deeply unsettling. Gardner explains how the forms of mental representation, like words, images, or numbers, aren't just tools. They're the very structure of how we think. Change the form, and you change the way someone sees the world. Think about the difference between reading a dry text about climate change versus watching a gut-wrenching documentary with starving polar bears. Same content, totally different impact. Your brain processes information differently depending on the form it's presented in, and Gardner argues this is where the real power of mind-changing lies. Want proof? Gardner recounts his own career-altering experience. He was a psychology grad student when he attended a talk by Norman Geschwind, a neurologist who broke down how the brain processes different types of information. Geschwind described patients who lost the ability to read words but could still recognize numbers, or artists whose painting skills were transformed, sometimes even improved, after brain damage. For Gardner, this was a light bulb moment. He realized that understanding the forms of mental representation wasn't just interesting, it was essential. But let's not get too sentimental here. The real takeaway is that you're likely stuck in one form of thinking and it's holding you back. Gardner illustrates this with a brilliant example, the 80-20 principle. This idea that 80% of outcomes often come from 20% of efforts is revolutionary, but only if you understand it. Some people get it immediately when they see it in a bar graph. Others need it explained in words or demonstrated with real-world examples. The point? If you're clinging to one way of thinking, you're missing out on a whole world of understanding. Gardner doesn't just stop at individual failures, he also takes aim at education and leadership. Schools, he argues, are some of the worst offenders when it comes to rigid forms of thinking. They force students to process everything through words and numbers, ignoring other forms like images, music, or hands-on experimentation. It's no wonder so many kids hate school. It's not that they're dumb, it's that their brains don't speak the school's preferred language. Here's where Gardner gets confrontational, and honestly, it's about time. He calls out leaders, whether in politics, business, or education, for failing to understand the importance of form. Leaders love to talk, to drown people in words and PowerPoint slides. But if they really wanted to inspire change, they'd use stories, visuals, or even emotional experiences to make their point. Gardner's message is clear. If you're trying to change minds and you're not paying attention to the forms of representation, you're failing. Key takeaway, you need to start thinking about the forms your thoughts take and how they're limiting you. If you're always explaining things in words, try using a diagram. If you're obsessed with numbers, try telling a story. The more ways you can represent an idea, the more likely it is to stick. And if you're trying to change someone else's mind, you better figure out what form resonates with them. But let's not kid ourselves. This isn't easy. Changing the forms of your mind takes effort, and most people won't bother. They'll keep trying to solve every problem with the same tired approach, wondering why nothing ever changes. Don't be one of those people. As Gardner makes painfully clear, the forms of the mind are your foundation. If you don't get them right, everything else is doomed to collapse. Chapter 3. The Power of Early Theories. Here's a slap of reality for you. Your mind is like a cheap foundation. The ideas you were spoon-fed as a kid are the same ones you're still standing on, cracked, unstable, and dragging down everything you've built since. Howard Gardner calls these early theories, the ideas we form as children to make sense of the world. And boy, are they powerful. Not in a good way. These early theories are like glitter at a craft party. They get everywhere, and good luck trying to clean them up later. Gardner doesn't pull punches in this chapter. He makes it crystal clear that your early theories don't just color your worldview, they dominate it. Think about how kids form theories. They see patterns, make connections, sometimes wildly incorrect ones, and then stick to their conclusions like their lives depend on it. A toddler watches the sun rise and sets, and suddenly, bam, the sun's a ball that moves because someone is pushing it. Cute, right? Except you do the same thing as an adult, clinging to flimsy ideas like, I'm not good at math, or success is all about hard work, long after reality has proven otherwise. The problem? Early theories are sticky, psychologically, emotionally, and even neurologically. Gardner points out that they're baked into our cognitive wiring during our formative years, when the brain is at its most impressionable. And here's the kicker. Once an early theory sets up shop in your head, it's almost impossible to evict. It's the squatter of your mind, and it's not paying rent. Take an example Gardner uses about kids and the concept of gravity. If a child believes objects fall because they're heavy, no amount of explaining Newton's laws will easily change that belief. You can show them experiments, diagrams, and physics equations, but their early theory is rooted in a gut-level understanding of the world. And gut level trumps intellect 9 times out of 10. Sound familiar? That's because it's not just kids. Adults are just as stubborn when it comes to their pet theories. Gardner doesn't let adults off the hook. He's quick to point out that early theories don't just affect individual thinking, they shape entire societies. He uses the example of religious and cultural narratives, stories we absorb as children that go on to dictate everything from morality to politics. These narratives are so deeply ingrained that questioning them feels like a personal attack. You're not just challenging ideas, you're challenging identity. That's why debates about religion, politics, or even parenting styles get so heated. Everyone's defending the theories they've held since childhood. Want more proof of the power of early theories? Gardner brings up the educational system, a breeding ground for reinforcing bad theories. Kids come to school with preconceived ideas about how the world works, and instead of dismantling these misconceptions, schools often double down. They prioritize rote memorization over critical thinking, teaching kids to parrot back facts rather than question their assumptions. Gardner argues that this approach only cements early theories, making it even harder to change minds later in life. And let's talk about the workplace, because early theories don't stay in the classroom. They follow you to your job, where they wreak havoc on decision making. Gardner highlights how leaders and managers often operate based on outdated beliefs they've never questioned. Think about the boss who believes the customer is always right, or micromanaging is the only way to ensure quality. These are early theories dressed up as business strategies, and they're as destructive as they are pervasive. So, what's the solution? Gardner doesn't sugarcoat it. Changing early theories is hard, really hard. It requires a combination of evidence, emotional resonance, and persistence. You can't just tell someone their beliefs are wrong. You have to show them over and over in ways that connect to their emotions and experiences. It's slow, painful, and often thankless work. But if you want to change minds, yours or anyone else's, it's the only way. The key takeaway from this chapter is, early theories are the skeletons in your mental closet. They're the reason you struggle to change bad habits, break through limiting beliefs, or see the world from someone else's perspective. And if you're not actively challenging them, they're running the show. Gardner's message is clear. Question everything, especially the ideas you've held the longest, because if you don't, those early theories will keep holding you back, and you'll only have yourself to blame. Chapter 4. Leading a diverse population. Let's get one thing straight. Leading a diverse population is not the feel-good kumbaya moment you think it is. It's hard, messy, and full of resistance. And yet, Howard Gardner dives in headfirst, tackling the harsh reality that trying to guide a group of people with different backgrounds, beliefs, and values is less like herding sheep and more like herding cats who all hate each other. Spoiler, you're probably doing it wrong. Gardner opens this chapter by taking aim at leaders who approach diversity with a one-size-fits-all mindset. If that's you, buckle up because you're about to get roasted. Here's the truth. What works for one group will not work for another. Period. Diverse populations are exactly that. Diverse. They bring different histories, experiences, and perspectives to the table. But instead of embracing that complexity, most leaders try to hammer everyone into the same shape. Gardner makes it clear, this approach is not only lazy, but doomed to fail. Take a second to think about the groups you've been part of, your workplace, your community, maybe even your family. Have you ever noticed how some voices dominate while others get drowned out? That's because leaders often cater to the majority while ignoring or silencing the minority. Gardner calls this out as not just ineffective, but dangerous. When people feel unheard, they disengage. And when they disengage, any hope of progress goes out the window. To illustrate his point, Gardner draws on examples from politics, education, and business. In politics, he examines leaders who've successfully united diverse populations. Think Nelson Mandela or Abraham Lincoln. What made them effective? They didn't try to flatten differences. Instead, they acknowledged and celebrated those differences while finding common ground. Mandela, for instance, didn't pretend apartheid-era South Africa could magically unite overnight. He worked to build bridges between racial groups while respecting their distinct identities. Contrast that with leaders who ignore diversity altogether, and you'll see why some nations thrive while others implode. Gardner also delves into the world of education, where diversity is both a blessing and a challenge. Teachers face classrooms filled with students from different cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds, and learning styles. The bad teachers, the ones Gardner implicitly drags, try to teach everyone the same way, sticking rigidly to one method and blaming the students who fall behind. The good teachers, on the other hand, adapt. They use multiple strategies to reach different kinds of learners, proving that flexibility is not just nice, it's essential. In business, Gardner highlights companies that have embraced diversity as a strength. He points to organizations that foster innovation by bringing together teams with varied perspectives. But, and this is a big but, he also warns that simply hiring a diverse workforce isn't enough. If the company culture doesn't encourage those voices to be heard, the diversity becomes cosmetic, a hollow performance designed to look good on paper while accomplishing nothing. Now, let's get real about the elephant in the room: resistance. Leading a diverse population means dealing with people who don't want to play nice. Gardner doesn't sugarcoat this. Some people are deeply uncomfortable with difference, and that discomfort can manifest as hostility, ignorance, or outright sabotage. A leader's job isn't to ignore this resistance, but to address it head on. And no, that doesn't mean bulldozing over dissenting voices. It means listening, understanding, and finding ways to bring even the most reluctant participants into the fold. One of the most compelling parts of this chapter is Gardner's focus on narratives. He argues that leaders need to craft stories that resonate with the diverse groups they're leading. These stories need to be inclusive enough to appeal to everyone while still respecting individual identities. It's a delicate balance, and most leaders fail miserably at it. Think about the last time a politician tried to appeal to the common man while completely ignoring marginalized communities. Yeah, it doesn't work. Gardner also emphasizes the importance of trust. Without trust, no leader can effectively guide a diverse population. Building trust takes time and consistency. It's not something you can fake. Leaders need to show that they're not just paying lip service to diversity, but genuinely valuing and respecting all voices. So, what's the key takeaway here? If you want to lead a diverse population, you need to stop being lazy. Diversity isn't a box to check or a PR move. It's a reality that demands nuanced, thoughtful leadership. You need to listen more than you talk, adapt more than you dictate, and build trust like your life depends on it. Because if you don't, you're not leading. You're just managing a slow-motion disaster. Gardner's message is simple but brutal. Leadership isn't about making everyone the same. It's about creating a space where differences can thrive. If you're not ready to do that work, step aside. Leadership is too important to be left in the hands of people who can't handle the complexity of the human experience. Chapter 5. Leading an Institution: How to Deal with a Uniform Population. Let's rip off the band-aid. Leading a uniform population is not easier than leading a diverse one. It's just different. Howard Gardner uses this chapter to call out leaders who treat institutions like static machines, assuming that a uniform population will march in lockstep. Spoiler alert, they won't. Even in the most homogeneous groups, whether a religious order, a military unit, or a corporate team, there are hidden layers of complexity and resistance waiting to trip you up. Gardner opens with a scathing critique of leaders who underestimate the challenge of managing uniformity. Sure, these populations might share common values, beliefs, or goals, but that doesn't mean they're clones. Beneath the surface, you'll find differences in interpretation, ambition, and personal priorities. And when leaders ignore these nuances, they create an environment ripe for discontent, disengagement, or outright rebellion. Take, for instance, traditional institutions like universities or churches. These organizations might seem monolithic from the outside, but Gardner argues that they're anything but. Professors at the same university may all value education, but ask them what that means, and you'll get wildly different answers. Is it about job preparation, intellectual curiosity, or personal growth? Similarly, members of a religious congregation might agree on the core tenets of their faith, but their individual practices and interpretations can vary dramatically. A leader who fails to recognize these internal tensions risks alienating the very people they're supposed to guide. One of the most striking examples Gardner uses is the military. On the surface, it's the epitome of a uniform population, rank structures, strict protocols, and a shared mission. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find a complex web of motivations, from patriotic ideals to career advancement to sheer necessity. Great military leaders, Gardner notes, understand this. They don't just bark orders, they inspire loyalty by connecting with their troops' individual reasons for serving. But here's where Gardner gets confrontational. Most leaders of uniform populations are lazy. They assume that shared values mean everyone will automatically fall in line. Gardner calls this the illusion of unity, and he's quick to point out its dangers. When leaders lean on this illusion, they become complacent, relying on tradition and authority to maintain order instead of actively engaging with their people. The result? A stagnant institution where change is almost impossible and morale plummets. To counter this, Gardner argues that leaders must focus on three key strategies: narrative, engagement, and adaptability. First, they need to craft a compelling narrative that reinforces the group's shared identity while leaving room for individual interpretation. This isn't just about repeating the mission statement, it's about creating a story that resonates on a personal level. Gardner gives the example of successful corporate leaders who frame their company's goals in ways that inspire both frontline workers and executives. Second, leaders need to engage actively with their populations. This means more than just holding meetings or sending out memos. It's about listening, understanding, and responding to the concerns and aspirations of the group. Gardner highlights the importance of symbolic gestures, actions that demonstrate a leader's commitment to their people. Think of CEOs who take pay cuts during tough times, or generals who eat the same rations as their troops. These acts might seem small, but they send a powerful message. I'm one of you, and I'm in this with you. Finally, adaptability is crucial. Even in the most uniform populations, change is inevitable. Whether it's new technology, shifting demographics, or external pressures, institutions must evolve to survive. Gardner warns that leaders who cling to outdated practices and rigid hierarchies will be left behind. The best leaders, he argues, are those who can balance tradition with innovation, maintaining the group's core values while embracing new ideas and approaches. Of course, none of this is easy. Gardner doesn't shy away from the challenges of leading a uniform population. He acknowledges the resistance leaders will face, both from individuals who fear change and from the institution itself, which often has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. But he's also clear that the effort is worth it. When leaders take the time to understand and engage with their populations, they create institutions that are not only stable, but also dynamic and resilient. So, what's the takeaway here? If you're leading a uniform population, stop coasting. Shared values and goals might give you a head start, but they're not enough to ensure success. You need to dig deeper, challenge assumptions, and connect with your people on a human level. And if you're not willing to do that work, step aside. Institutions deserve leaders who are willing to put in the effort to understand and guide them, not just managers who mistake surface-level harmony for real unity. Gardner's message is as clear as it is confrontational. Leadership in a uniform population isn't about maintaining the status quo. It's about constantly questioning and refining it. If you're not doing that, you're not leading, you're babysitting, and nobody needs another babysitter. Chapter 6. Changing Minds Indirectly Through Scientific Discoveries, Scholarly Breakthroughs, and Artistic Creations. Here's a reality check for you. If you think changing minds is just about arguing harder, louder, or longer, you're doing it wrong. Howard Gardner drops the hammer in this chapter, showing how some of the most profound shifts in human thinking don't happen in debate halls or boardrooms, but through indirect channels: science, scholarship, and art. These tools work precisely because they bypass our defenses and hit us where it matters: our curiosity, our sense of wonder, and yes, sometimes our gut emotions. Gardner starts by highlighting the power of scientific discoveries to transform how we see the world. Think about Darwin's theory of evolution. Before Darwin, the prevailing mindset was that every living thing was plopped onto Earth in its current form by some divine hand. Enter Darwin, armed with meticulous evidence and a killer argument about natural selection, and suddenly, humanity's place in the universe shifted. But here's the kicker. Darwin didn't go door to door convincing people. His work spoke for itself, leaving people to wrestle with its implications on their own. This is where Gardner gets confrontational, and frankly, it's about time. Most people are resistant to direct challenges to their beliefs. You can't just walk up to someone and say, "You're wrong, and here's why." Their defenses will go up faster than you can say confirmation bias. But a groundbreaking scientific discovery? That's different. It sneaks past the ego and forces people to confront new truths, often without them realizing it. Gardner doesn't stop at science. He also delves into the world of scholarly breakthroughs. Think of Sigmund Freud, who single-handedly dragged humanity's understanding of the mind out of the shadows. Love him or hate him, Freud fundamentally altered how we think about ourselves. Concepts like the unconscious, repression, and Freudian slips became part of the cultural lexicon, changing not just psychology, but art, literature, and even everyday conversation. Again, Freud didn't argue his way into the zeitgeist. His ideas simply resonated so deeply that they couldn't be ignored. And then there's art. Oh, how Gardner loves art. If science hits the brain and scholarship hits the intellect, art hits the soul. He talks about the way artistic creations can shake us to our core, challenging our assumptions in ways words never could. Take Picasso's Guernica, for example. You don't need a lecture on the horrors of war when you stand in front of that painting. It is the lecture, condensed into a visceral, unforgettable experience. Gardner's argument is clear. These indirect methods of changing minds are powerful because they operate on multiple levels: intellectual, emotional, and even physical. They don't just tell you something new, they make you feel it, live it, and wrestle with it until you can't go back to your old way of thinking. But, and this is a big but, Gardner doesn't let anyone off the hook. He takes a sharp jab at the laziness of our modern era, where people consume ideas passively without engaging with them deeply. Watching a documentary about climate change might make you feel something, but unless you're willing to dig into the data, grapple with the arguments, and change your behavior, you're just a spectator. Gardner's message here is blunt. Consuming ideas isn't enough. You have to act on them. This chapter also comes with a warning. These indirect methods can be double-edged swords. Just as art and science can inspire progress, they can also be used to manipulate. Gardner points out how propaganda often disguises itself as art or scholarship, preying on emotions to push harmful agendas. Think about how Nazi propaganda films used powerful visuals and music to spread hateful ideologies. The lesson: be critical. Not everything that resonates is true, and not everything that moves you is good. So, what's the takeaway? If you want to change minds, stop thinking like a battering ram and start thinking like a sculptor. Science, scholarship, and art are tools that can reshape perspectives without triggering resistance. But don't just sit back and admire these tools. Use them. Whether you're a leader, teacher, or creative, your job is to create ideas and experiences that challenge, inspire, and transform. Gardner's challenge to you is simple but confrontational. Stop relying on shallow arguments and start creating something meaningful. The world doesn't need more loud voices. It needs more powerful ideas, beautifully crafted and deeply felt. If you're not willing to put in the effort to create those ideas, step aside. Progress waits for no one. Chapter 7. Mind changing in the formal setting. Let's not mince words here. Formal settings are where mind changing should happen, but often doesn't. Schools, universities, corporate training programs, these are supposed to be the crucibles where new ideas are forged and old assumptions are burned away. Instead, they're often intellectual graveyards where creativity goes to die, and Howard Gardner is not afraid to call this out. This chapter is a wake-up call for anyone who thinks that formal environments are naturally conducive to change. Gardner shows us how these settings can either be the perfect launching pad for transformation or the perfect trap to keep people stuck in their old ways. He starts by tearing into the way formal education is usually handled. Schools, Gardner argues, are some of the least innovative places on earth. Sure, they're packed with potential. The minds of students are at their most malleable, but most schools squander that potential by relying on rote memorization and standardized testing. It's like trying to plant a garden using concrete. Rather than challenging students to think critically or question their assumptions, schools too often teach them to play it safe, follow the rules, and avoid failure at all costs. Gardner uses a fascinating example of how mind-changing should work in schools, the case of the conceptual revolution. Imagine a science teacher who introduces students to the theory of evolution. At first, many resist the idea. It clashes with their early theories, their religious beliefs, or just their intuition. But over time, with the right evidence, engaging narratives, and hands-on experiments, some students start to shift their thinking. That's mind-changing done right. The problem? Too many teachers lack the tools, support, or creativity to make this happen. And it's not just schools. Gardner turns his sharp gaze to corporate training programs, which are often a hotbed of mediocrity. Companies shell out millions on workshops and seminars, but how often do these actually change anyone's mind? Be honest. When was the last time a mandatory PowerPoint presentation inspired you to rethink your approach to anything? Exactly. Gardner argues that these programs fail because they treat employees like empty vessels to be filled with information, rather than complex individuals with deeply ingrained habits and beliefs. Here's where Gardner gets confrontational. If you're running a formal program and you're not actively engaging people's emotions, values, and personal experiences, you're wasting everyone's time. Facts and figures alone don't change minds. You need stories, symbols, and experiences that resonate on a gut level. You need to shake people out of their complacency and make them uncomfortable, because discomfort is where real change begins. One of the standout examples in this chapter is Gardner's analysis of military training. The military, despite its reputation for rigidity, is actually one of the most effective formal settings for changing minds. Why? Because it doesn't just teach skills, it reshapes identities. New recruits are immersed in an environment that challenges their old ways of thinking and forces them to adopt new ones. From the language they use to the way they see themselves as part of a team, every aspect of military training is designed to create a fundamental shift in perspective. But Gardner also warns against the dangers of coercion in formal settings. There's a fine line between persuasion and manipulation, and formal environments can easily cross it. He points to cults as a chilling example of how structured settings can be used to brainwash rather than educate. The lesson: leaders in formal settings must be ethical in their approach, focusing on empowerment rather than control. Gardner wraps up the chapter with a call to action. Formal settings need to get their act together. Whether it's a classroom, a training room, or a boardroom, the goal should be to foster genuine transformation. This means creating an environment where people feel safe to question their assumptions, experiment with new ideas, and even fail. It means moving beyond lectures and worksheets to create immersive, engaging experiences that leave a lasting impact. Key takeaway: formal settings are powerful tools for mind changing, but only if they're used wisely. If you're a teacher, trainer, or leader, stop relying on outdated methods and start thinking about how to engage people on every level, intellectually, emotionally, and socially. And if you're someone stuck in a formal setting that's not working for you, don't just sit there. Demand better, or better yet, find ways to take control of your own learning. Gardner's final word on the subject is as confrontational as it is inspiring. Formal settings are a double-edged sword. They can either be places of profound growth or stifling conformity. The choice is up to the people who run them, and to those brave enough to challenge the system when it falls short. Chapter 8, Mind Changing Up Close. Let's talk about the one-on-one battlefield of changing minds. Howard Gardner hits us with the uncomfortable truth that the most powerful transformations don't happen in grand speeches or packed lecture halls. They happen up close, in intimate, personal interactions. And if you think you're good at this, think again. Chances are you're terrible at it, because changing minds face to face is messy, emotional, and requires a level of self-awareness most people simply don't have. Gardner begins this chapter by dragging those who think persuasion is all about having the better argument. Spoiler alert, it's not. Logic might win debates, but it rarely changes hearts. If someone's deeply held beliefs are tied to their identity, your airtight reasoning will bounce off them like rubber bullets. Gardner argues that effective one-on-one mind changing is a subtle art. It's about connection, trust, and yes, a little bit of manipulation. The good kind, if you can stomach that. Take therapy, for example. Gardner points to therapists as some of the best examples of people who change minds up close. Why? Because they don't just tell their clients what to do. They guide them to discover new perspectives on their own. A good therapist doesn't say, "Your fear of failure is irrational." Instead, they help you explore where that fear comes from and how it's holding you back, letting you come to your own conclusions. That's mind-changing in its purest form. But Gardner isn't here to glorify therapists or any other so-called mind experts. he makes it clear that even in the most supportive settings, changing minds is an uphill battle. People are resistant to change by nature. They cling to their beliefs like life rafts, even when those beliefs are sinking them. Your job, if you're brave enough to take it on, is to show them there's a better way, and then stick around while they flail and fight against the current. One of the standout parts of this chapter is Gardner's exploration of empathy. Empathy, he argues, is the secret weapon of one-on-one persuasion. It's not about agreeing with someone or even liking them. It's about understanding where they're coming from, even when their perspective seems completely alien to you. If you can get inside someone's head and see the world through their eyes, you have a much better chance of nudging them toward change. Gardner illustrates this with a powerful anecdote about a teacher working with a struggling student. The student, let's call him Jake, was on the verge of dropping out. He believed he was stupid, unteachable, and destined to fail. Instead of lecturing Jake about the importance of education, the teacher took the time to understand his fears and insecurities. They discovered that Jake's resistance to school wasn't about laziness. It was about a deep-seated fear of looking foolish in front of his peers. Once the teacher addressed this fear, Jake started to see school as a place of growth rather than humiliation. But Gardner doesn't let us off easy here. He reminds us that empathy isn't enough on its own. You also need patience, persistence, and the willingness to embrace discomfort. Changing someone's mind up close means sitting in the trenches with them while they wrestle with their doubts and fears. It's not glamorous, and it's certainly not quick. But when it works, the results can be life-changing for both of you. Gardner also calls out the role of credibility in one-on-one mind-changing. If people don't trust you, they won't listen to you, period. This is why building trust is so crucial, whether you're a teacher, leader, or friend. Gardner gives the example of a doctor trying to convince a patient to adopt a healthier lifestyle. If the patient doesn't see the doctor as trustworthy, or worse, if the doctor comes across as judgmental, they're not going to change a thing. But a doctor who takes the time to build a relationship, show genuine concern, and provide support, that's a game changer. The chapter doesn't shy away from the dark side of one-on-one mind-changing either. Gardner warns about the potential for abuse in these intimate settings. Cult leaders, con artists, and manipulative partners are masters of up-close persuasion, using their skills to exploit rather than empower. The lesson here is clear. Just because someone can change your mind doesn't mean they should. Be vigilant about who you let into your head. Key takeaway: changing minds up close is both an art and a responsibility. If you're in a position to influence someone, whether as a teacher, therapist, friend, or leader, you owe it to them to approach the task with care, empathy, and integrity. And if you're on the receiving end of persuasion, be equally vigilant about who you let into your mental space. Gardner's final challenge in this chapter is brutally confrontational. If you're not willing to invest the time and emotional labor required for one-on-one mind changing, don't bother. This isn't a game for the faint of heart. It's messy, it's exhausting, and it's rarely linear. But when done right, it has the power to change lives, not just for the person you're helping, but for you too. So, the next time you're tempted to throw logic bombs at someone, stop, listen, understand, and then maybe you'll have a shot at changing their mind. Chapter 9. Changing one's own mind. Alright, let's get real. Changing someone else's mind is hard, but changing your own mind, that's an Olympic-level challenge. In this chapter, Howard Gardner doesn't just dissect why it's so difficult. He dares you to take a long, hard look at your own beliefs, habits, and assumptions and start dismantling them. Spoiler, it's going to hurt. But as Gardner points out, if you're not willing to confront your own mental baggage, what hope do you have of growing, let alone helping anyone else change? Gardner begins with the brutally obvious. We're creatures of habit, and our minds are no exception. By the time we hit adulthood, most of our beliefs and patterns of thinking are set in stone, or at least hardened concrete. Why? Because our brains are wired for efficiency, not accuracy. Once we form a belief, our minds work overtime to reinforce it, seeking out evidence that supports it and ignoring anything that contradicts it. It's called confirmation bias, and it's the reason your Facebook feed is an echo chamber of your own opinions. But Gardner isn't interested in blaming the brain's quirks for our stubbornness. He dives deeper, pointing out that our beliefs are often tied to our sense of identity. If you've built your entire self-image around being logical or compassionate or hardworking, admitting that one of your core beliefs is wrong feels like admitting that you're wrong. And let's be honest, who wants to do that? Gardner doesn't sugarcoat it. Changing your mind means dismantling parts of your identity, and that's terrifying. Gardner uses a fascinating anecdote to illustrate this point. The story of Whittaker Chambers, a former Soviet spy who famously defected and became a staunch anti-communist. Chambers didn't just change his political allegiance, he changed his entire worldview. But the process wasn't quick or painless. It was a long, agonizing journey that involved questioning everything he thought he knew about himself and the world. Gardner's point is clear. Real mind changing isn't about flipping a switch. It's about burning down the house and rebuilding it from scratch. So, how do you even begin to change your own mind? Gardner lays out a roadmap, but fair warning, it's not for the faint of heart. The first step, he argues, is self-awareness. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. This means taking a hard look at your beliefs, identifying where they came from, and questioning whether they still serve you. It's not enough to say, I believe X. You have to ask yourself, why do I believe X? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? And what would it mean if I were wrong? Next comes exposure to new ideas. Gardner emphasizes the importance of stepping outside your comfort zone and engaging with perspectives that challenge your own. This doesn't mean doom scrolling Twitter for opposing views. It means genuinely listening, reading, and reflecting. He points to examples of scientists and scholars who changed their minds after encountering groundbreaking research or alternative theories. The lesson: if you're not actively seeking out new information, you're not growing, you're stagnating. But Gardner doesn't stop there. He delves into the role of emotion in self-transformation. Logic alone isn't enough to change your mind. You need an emotional catalyst. This could be a personal crisis, a profound experience, or even a story that resonates deeply with you. Gardner gives the example of people who've radically shifted their views on issues like climate change or social justice after witnessing the human impact up close. It's a reminder that change isn't just intellectual, it's visceral. Of course, Gardner isn't naive. He knows that self-change is hard and he doesn't shy away from the obstacles. One of the biggest, resistance. Your mind will fight back. It will cling to old beliefs like a drowning man clings to a life raft, even if that raft is dragging you under. Gardner argues that overcoming this resistance requires discipline, persistence, and most importantly, humility. You have to be willing to admit when you're wrong and start over. One of the most compelling parts of this chapter is Gardner's exploration of incremental versus transformative change. He acknowledges that not every mind shift needs to be a dramatic, life-altering epiphany. Sometimes change happens in small, gradual steps. Think of it like remodeling a house, replacing one piece of bad plumbing at a time until the whole system works better. The key is to keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps. Key takeaway? Changing your own mind is the ultimate act of courage. It requires you to face your fears, question your identity, and let go of the comforting illusion that you've got it all figured out. Gardner doesn't promise it will be easy, but he does promise it will be worth it. Because in the end, the ability to change your own mind isn't just a sign of intelligence, it's a sign of maturity, resilience, and true leadership. Gardner leaves us with a challenge. Stop clinging to your old beliefs like they're sacred. They're not. They're just ideas, and ideas can change. The question isn't whether you can change your mind, it's whether you're brave enough to try. Chapter 10, Epilogue, The Future of Mind Changing. Let's cut to the chase. Howard Gardner's closing chapter is a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at your feet. The world is changing faster than ever, and if you think you can navigate it with the same tired ways of thinking, you're fooling yourself. In this epilogue, Gardner takes a sharp, unflinching look at the future of mind changing, and spoiler alert, it's not for the faint of heart. He's not just talking about why changing minds is important. He's making the case that it's the single most essential skill for survival in an era of information overload, cultural polarization, and technological upheaval. Gardner starts by dragging us into the digital age, an era where every belief, no matter how absurd, can find its tribe on the internet. Think about it. Flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists, they all thrive in echo chambers where their ideas are never questioned. Gardner doesn't mince words here. The rise of social media has made mind-changing both harder and more urgent. Why? Because we're drowning in noise and most people are too busy shouting into the void to listen. And then there's the elephant in the room, AI and algorithms. Gardner points out that these tools, while powerful, are also part of the problem. They're designed to feed you more of what you already believe, reinforcing your biases and keeping you in your cozy little bubble. It's like having a butler who serves you the same meal every day because he thinks it's your favorite, even when you're starving for something new. If you want to change minds, including your own, you'll have to fight against the very systems designed to keep you stuck. Gardner pivots to the cultural and political landscape, where mind changing is desperately needed but rarely achieved. He highlights how polarization isn't just a problem, it's a symptom of our collective failure to engage with opposing views. Politicians preach to their bases, pundits pander to their audiences, and everyone else just digs their trenches deeper. Gardner argues that the future depends on our ability to break this cycle, to find ways to bridge divides and create dialogue instead of division. One of the most powerful parts of this chapter is Gardner's exploration of education's role in shaping the future of mind changing. He envisions a world where schools don't just teach facts, but also teach kids how to think critically, question assumptions, and engage with diverse perspectives. It's an ambitious vision, but Gardner makes a compelling case that this is the only way to prepare future generations for the challenges ahead. If we don't teach kids how to change their minds, he warns, they'll grow up as rigid, dogmatic adults incapable of adapting to a rapidly evolving world. Gardner also takes a deep dive into the psychology of resistance, explaining why the future of mind changing will require us to confront our deepest fears and insecurities. Changing your mind isn't just hard, it's scary. It means admitting you were wrong, letting go of old identities, and stepping into the unknown. Gardner argues that the only way forward is to embrace this discomfort, not as a weakness, but as a strength. Growth, after all, is impossible without pain. And then there's the question of ethics. Gardner doesn't shy away from the darker side of mind changing. He warns that as our understanding of persuasion and influence grows, so too does the potential for abuse. From propaganda to psychological manipulation, the tools of mind changing can be used for harm as easily as for good. Gardner challenges us to think critically about how these tools are wielded, emphasizing the importance of integrity, transparency, and accountability. So, what does the future of mind changing look like? Gardner paints a picture that's equal parts daunting and inspiring. It's a future where leaders, educators, and ordinary people must learn to navigate complexity, embrace uncertainty, and engage with opposing views. It's a future where technology can either be a tool for enlightenment or a weapon of division, depending on how we choose to use it. And most importantly, it's a future where the ability to change minds, our own and others, isn't just a skill, but a necessity. Key takeaway: the future of mind changing is in your hands. Whether you're a teacher, leader, parent, or just someone trying to make sense of the chaos, the responsibility is yours. You can either cling to your old ways of thinking, letting the world pass you by, or you can rise to the challenge, learning to adapt, grow, and engage with the complexity of the modern age. Gardner's final words hit like a punch to the gut. If you're not willing to change your mind, you're part of the problem. The world is evolving, and the only way to keep up is to evolve with it. So stop making excuses. Stop hiding behind your biases. The future demands more of you, and if you're not ready to step up, it will leave you behind. Conclusion: let's not beat around the bush. If you've made it this far and still think changing minds, yours or anyone else's, is optional, you're not paying attention. Howard Gardner didn't write Changing Minds to make you feel warm and fuzzy. He wrote it to slap you across the face with the uncomfortable truth that the way you think, lead, and engage with the world is probably outdated and ineffective. Every chapter of this book has been a reality check. Gardner has dragged you through the chaotic contents of your mind, exposed the rigid forms of your thinking, and obliterated your cherished early theories. He's ripped apart your approach to leading diverse and uniform populations, shown you how indirect methods can outsmart your defenses, and taken you up close and personal with the gritty realities of one-on-one persuasion. He's even shoved you into the terrifying mirror of self-reflection, forcing you to confront the hardest task of all, changing your own mind. And guess what? If you're still clinging to the belief that you're right about everything and everyone else is the problem, then congratulations, you've missed the entire point. This book isn't just about understanding how minds change, it's a call to action, a demand, a dare. Gardner is challenging you to stop being lazy, stop hiding behind your biases, and start doing the hard, messy work of growth. Because here's the thing, the world isn't waiting for you to catch up. While you're busy defending your ego, digging your trenches, and scrolling your algorithm-curated bubble, the future is speeding ahead. And if you don't learn how to adapt, how to think critically, engage empathetically, and embrace the discomfort of change, you'll be left behind, stuck in the intellectual stone age while everyone else evolves. So, what are you gonna do? Keep coasting on autopilot, clinging to your outdated beliefs like a security blanket? Or are you going to pick up this book, dig into its lessons, and actually start changing your mind? Because here's the brutal truth. Gardner has given you the tools, the roadmap, the wake-up call, but the work is on you. And if you think you can just skim this conclusion and call it a day, think again. This book is packed with insights, strategies, and examples that will force you to rethink everything. If you have the guts to read it, cover to cover. Don't cheat yourself out of the chance to grow because you're too stubborn or too scared to face the truth. So, here's your next move. Go buy Changing Minds by Howard Gardner. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Because if you want to stop being part of the problem and start being part of the solution, this book isn't just a suggestion, it's a necessity. Wake up, change your mind, and then maybe, just maybe, you'll change the world.